And the reason I'm starting with this is because actually the origin of the term cannibal probably came from the Carib peoples in the Caribbean islands, which it talks about in the first part of this, that Columbus said they were cannibals or flesh eaters. So we'll talk about them in a little bit and why we have to be careful about that. But I want to start out with this quote because, like in the last class, I was trying to tell you or claim that the colonial Latin America is also where we have this big speculation on who are human beings? How should human beings treat each other? And I kind of wish they start out with a quote. This chapter, of course, is about Native Americans, but they start out with a quote that's from a Spanish friar about how there it is. On the mainland, the Indians eat human flesh. I didn't even have to go to Columbus. There it is, right there. Their first quote is basically this huge racist quote about Native Americans, which is a weird way to start when your whole chapter is supposed to be about, Native Americans before the great encounter or the conquest. I looked around, I couldn't find one, but there are quotes that indigenous peoples in the Americas reflected upon the Europeans, and they didn't have always the best things to say about the Europeans as well. So I wish they would have started out with a quote like that. But I wanted to start with this quote because it's an example of a European who is sort of thinking differently than this Spanish friar about the people that they are encountering. So Montaigne is saying that, yeah, sure, by the laws of reason, we would call them barbarians, right? By the laws of reason. But if we compare them to us, we surpass them in every kind of barbarity. Just to say, he was looking at the conquest and he saw that, like, wait a second, we're doing much more terrible things than any of the things that we're accusing these people of doing. So I wanted to sort of center that to start off with that quote. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about this idea of how the Indians are eating human flesh, an obsession of the Europeans. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about how people got into the Americas, and I want to sort of update our account here a little bit. The historians had a pretty good account of how things came to be on page 4 there, but a more up-to-date account came out a couple years ago, written by an anthropologist named Jennifer Raff, who looked at some of the genetic evidence and the historical evidence for how people came into the Americas. And what we now believe, or we now think, or there's much more evidence for, is that obviously the people came into the Americas from what is now Siberia or Northeast Asia, spent a decent amount of time in a place that is now submerged called Beringia, and then probably, and this is where it differs from what Restall and Lane say, probably for the most part came down the coast, and from the coast spread inland. So they weren't sailing across the ocean, but they were using ships or using watercraft to travel much more quickly, probably diverged here into both parts of South America. Now, the evidence for this, the genetic evidence, is pretty good. It's not 100%. No evidence is ever 100%. A lot of people had speculated that this must have been the main way that people got into the Americas because people tended to show up in the Americas mostly kind of around the same time archaeologically. And if it was purely an overland dispersal, it's hard to say how people could get into all these places so relatively quickly and so relatively close together in time. So the problem has always been that a lot of the archaeological evidence for the sea routes was submerged, and so it couldn't be, you can't argue from no evidence. But this is what people tend to think. Now, there were probably also the traditional story of big game hunters chasing mammoths across the land bridge. That probably happened too, but this seems to be the main route of dispersal. What is very important here is that we realize that the people here were not aliens and they were not from Atlantis or other ideas that people would have. That they were inferior and that they hadn't built those things, that they were unable, that they must have had help from outer space, or they were from Atlantis, or they were from somewhere else. And so this is hugely important because those ideas, as Ryan quoted on page 3, the overwhelming European tendency was to view natives as a single inferior people, that they couldn't have done those things, that they weren't able to accomplish those things. The idea that they did not build their own civilizations. Also, crucially, they were not Europeans. We'll talk about why the Portuguese and the Spanish were in a much more a conquering mood once they got here. Whereas the Vikings were just trying to live. They were probably in a conquering mood as well, but they didn't make it very far. The reason I say that they were not Europeans is because these settlements did not influence the development of the indigenous civilizations. They did not spread. So there are some people who want to believe that there's a bunch of people who came over from the Atlantic and that's where we got the Native Americans, but that is simply untrue and false. They were also not from Egypt. They were not the lost tribes of Israel, which again has been floated, but they weren't. They were probably before what many archaeologists refer to as the Clovis hunting technologies, or some spear points and other points that were found in Clovis, New Mexico. And so there was a long time in which people believed that that was the stuff that people came over with. It is now thought that the Clovis hunting projectiles were developed in the Americas. And so people were here before what is called the Clovis first hypothesis. And that, again, that these coastal routes, although land routes cannot be ruled out, but the coastal routes were probably more important than land. Columbus was trying, and he wanted to convince his people that he was in India. I'm not sure. I think he thought he was on some islands off the coast of India, and so he did name this and so I mean, and so yes, we have this curious historical tendency. For example, the Caribbean is still referred to as the West Indies. It's a name that stuck, and it's a name that then encompassed an entire group of people, and basically they were unable to name themselves. In this chapter, Restall and Lane call them Native Americans, which is better, I guess I would say. And in my son's class, they called them the first Americans. That was my problem with this. It sounds like people were coming in waving an American flag already, because this was part of American history, and they talked about the first Americans as if they were already kind of, yeah, exactly. So Native Americans is better, but there is still a problem with America in general. Where do we get the word America from? Yes.
Wasn't it a guy named Vespucci who was like an explorer who, yeah, we basically named the continent after an explorer.
Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian explorer, like Columbus, who was also Italian, and they were buddies. He was one of the people who mapped out the coast of Brazil, and so was credited with understanding that there was a continent from the European perspective. But Columbus actually was dead before the Americas got even named. So when you say people are Native Americans, you're saying that they're native to a place that was named. They had nothing to do with that name either. There have been some attempts. Now, obviously, the various groups have their own names for themselves. it's unclear to the extent to which people thought about, the people that were here thought about these places as a continent. There are some people who believe that the people in Panama, who had this sense of, being able to traverse both the North and South American continent, knew about the scope of these worlds, and they called it Abya Yala, which is, our world. And so some people have thought about this as an alternative. Some groups in North America referred to North America as Turtle Island. And some people have said, well, the turtle is like, you have the head over there and and this would imply a kind of great understanding of geography if America is kind of like this, like a turtle, which would be kind of amazing. It's unclear, however, if this is like meant to be a literal thing or more like a metaphor for the creation of the world. But, it's an alternative way of naming things. In general, there's been a tendency, I think, to talk about not necessarily Native Americans, but indigenous peoples or indigenous peoples of the Americas, if we want to be more precise, because we might also talk about Aboriginal peoples in Australia, different groups. In Canada, the groups there sometimes refer to themselves as First Nations. So that's interesting because it's getting away again from this idea of America at all or Canada at all and talking about their groups as being the First Nations here. Other people have kind of been against that idea because it adopts the idea of a national terminology. So some people, again, in Latin America, a lot of the Indigenous has become in some ways the preferred term. I'll just note here that there are some people in the United States who believe that the best term for themselves is American Indians. And, I'm not going to argue if you want to adopt that term and believe that that's the best term. I'm not going to say it's not right. I mean, some people want to say that that's a good term. In some ways, it's been how sometimes certain labels are appropriated by people. Cannibalism. Now, the thing is this very book, it starts off on the mainland, the Indians eat human flesh. And it is probable, although there's different ways of thinking of it, that it was a Caribbean society, a place in that Columbus had stumbled onto that gives us the origin of the term cannibalism and cannibal. And as you can see here, as they start the book off, cannibalism became this obsession that the Europeans had. They went around the world, and you can see here, this is the title of a book that I get some of this information from. This also happened in the South Seas, in the South Asia as well. They would go around and basically want to know if the people there were cannibals. That was one of the first questions they asked. The problem is, Liam's probably seen me do this a few times, is how do you ask people if they are cannibals if you don't speak their language? How would you do that? Yeah, Liam. Huh? You start biting people. It would involve a certain amount of miming. So you might point to somebody and point to your own arm and start, trying to convey this sense of, are you a cannibal? Now, if I do that, if I point to you and I point to my arm and I bite it like this, what are you, who do not speak my language, going to think of me?
Maybe you're a cannibal.
That maybe I'm a cannibal. Exactly. In fact, they're like, whoa, hey, these guys have come to eat us. Right? So the thing is that once this kind of got sorted out a little bit, then people started to use this back and forth. For one thing, the Europeans justified the conquest and the subjugation of other people on the basis of, well, they're cannibals. We have to do this. We have to show them the right way to live. But on the other hand, people would, how to say, they would use this. So let's say that you figured out these Europeans that had come here with some ships and guns and stuff, that they were very not happy about cannibals. Often people would be like, oh no, we're not cannibals. But those guys over there, you can see those guys on the other island, they're the real cannibals. Go get them. Right? So people would use this, they'd manipulate it. Or if you wanted to scare people off, you'd be like, yeah, we're cannibals here. We'll eat you if you come. Get out of here. So it becomes this kind of, again, when you dig into, and obviously there have been instances in ritual and other ways in which people have done things like this over time. But when you dig into these accounts, the idea that people would for sort of protein eat other people's flesh is actually usually turns out to be an exaggeration or something that people have used to manipulate. And so they'd always be like, oh yeah, we did that 100 years ago, or those people over there did that. It doesn't seem to stick. A similar thing happens with human sacrifice. And this is something that, as Restall and Lane note, was often used and is still something that most people think about when it comes to, say, the Aztecs. This is something that Europeans were sort of obsessed with and used as a justification for why people deserve to be conquered and subjugated. Now, before we get into what the Aztecs were actually doing, I just want to point out that the Europeans themselves were not exactly the nicest people at this time. They tended to execute criminals by, doing things like pulling them apart with 4 horses, and just ripping them limb from limb. This is, public executions were not uncommon during this time, just for stealing something. When the Crusades were not exactly or as we'll talk about in what they call the Reconquista of Spain and Portugal from the Muslims, yeah, it wasn't always the nicest practices that people had. So when we compare, if you run the numbers, as brutal as the Aztec practices were, and it doesn't seem to be statistically more than what the Europeans were doing, just under a different name. Now, that said, right, who talked about this? Noah, you notice that these were pretty intense things that they were doing. We don't want to, they were pretty harsh, right? I thought you wrote about that. The Aztec, yeah. Yeah, they were pretty they were pretty intense people. So some people have speculated, there's a link here, that what the Aztecs, that there wasn't, it wasn't necessarily the idea of human sacrifice, but the Aztecs prized hand-to-hand combat and capturing people. And that was the mark of being a great warrior. If you could defeat someone in battle, but like close range, and capture them and kill them later on. Right? And so that would be, oh, you've done something amazing. You've captured a person in hand-to-hand combat and killed them later on. The Europeans thought this was terrible, right? You're not supposed to, in their view, this would be killing captives. But in the Aztec view, that was just the war process. That's what you did. You captured people and then you killed them. The Europeans thought that was barbaric. But of course, the Europeans wanted to kill people right on the spot, right? So the Aztecs, when the Europeans were shooting them from afar, thought that was like, that was cowardly. Why would you kill someone on the spot when you're supposed to capture them in hand-to-hand combat? These cowardly Europeans don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to fight like a true warrior should. Now, I don't know. That's somewhat speculative, but it's an interesting idea about, what was going on. Again, they probably equally killed the same number of people, just in different ways. Restall and Lane said that we should use the term ritual execution, which is a more neutral than human sacrifice, a phrase that carries much negative, even racist baggage. Again, it was used to sort of justify the conquest, but we have to be careful of it. I say, oh yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, perhaps some people did do this voluntarily within Aztec society, but I think for other peoples around the Aztec who were being conquered by them in this way, it probably really, really pissed them off. And, they did not have the reputation among the groups that were around them, not just for the Europeans, of being the nice guys on the continent. They were sort of the mean ones. And this is important to us when we talk about both the Aztec and the Inca, which we will in later chapters, because these were empires, but they also had a lot of enemies around them, or people that they had subjugated who were not excited about being under Aztec rule. So yeah, they might have gone voluntarily, because if they didn't go, then the Aztecs were going to come in and kill everybody else in their village. So they're like, okay, I'll go. I'd rather have be me than have it be my, it's kind of like, what was that? Oh, the Hunger Games, There you go. Perpetuation of for the world to go on. So that's why, again, I wanted to bring us back to this quote that, in some ways, yeah, there are these sort of standards of reason that we can have, but in comparison to what other practices of what the Europeans were doing at the time, it was it was comparable, let us say that. All right, so what we want to get from this chapter is our understanding of how in the Americas were what Restall and Lane call a rich and diverse world of people. So there are a lot of misconceptions about who was in the Americas. And one of the misconceptions is that all the people here were somehow in these little tribal groups. There weren't very many of them. And that basically, it was a sparsely populated kind of, blank slate Garden of Eden type situation. So this is a myth that has probably persisted. Josie, you cited that our authors say that there were at least 65 million people in the Americas. Other people put the estimate higher. Now, most of the people were concentrated in two areas, the Aztec and the Inca, and also the Maya, although the Maya were not sort of an urban empire at the time that the Europeans arrived. But again, people also get into just those groups. And so people get fanatic about either the Aztecs or the Incas or the Maya, and they forget about all the other people. So there were lots of different societies. Some had come and gone before the Europe. They had a rich history of societies as well. And so I mentioned the Maya, for example, and there's all this speculation of, why did the Maya have all these wonderful things that they built, but then they seem to have declined. And so there's a lot of speculation about why did they use the word collapse? Why did the Maya collapse? Why did the Maya disappear? And such tendencies are, again, somewhat misleading, because certainly they were not an empire like they were before when the Europeans arrived. But there's still 6 million people today who speak Maya languages that are derived from what the Maya would have been speaking. So, the idea that people just went away or collapsed or disappeared, we have to be careful of, and we have to understand that what's going on. So we have this way rich and diverse world going on, and the question becomes, how do we categorize this diversity? How do we group this, or how do we sort people into something that we can understand? And this is always a problem when you have, or always an issue that people make when people come in various forms, is what do we want to do with them? Our authors give us some categories, which Ryan and Pluto talked about. They talk about non-sedentary people, and they use the category of semi-sedentary and segmented sedentary, and concentrated sedentary. What do you notice about these categorizations of people? Whether or not they're moving around. Yeah, it's kind of funny. They all contain the word sedentary. Every so often they drop the word sedentary and talk about segmented and concentrated. But if you go back to the original, it's all dependent on how much they're moving around. Sedentary, semi-sedentary, non-sedentary, and then segmented sedentary, which I have no idea what that is. Now, here are some other categories that you might. Pluto, you have said you had never heard the category of non-sedentary. Have you ever heard the category hunting and gathering societies? Yeah, that sounds more familiar. How about horticultural or agricultural societies, or grouped as tribes and chiefdoms? That sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, those of you who have taken an anthropology class probably recognize these categories, which are basically kind of correspond to what Restall and Lane calls sedentary and non-sedentary. So those of you who have taken, archaeologists especially like these categories, they give us a broad kind of, these are, how to say, these are the traditional anthropology categories, and many people have criticized these categories, but they give you kind of just a broad, quick way to talk about different forms of living. I was trying to think about this, and I think that historians, that's why they use these categories. So for those of you who've been in anthropology courses, you would know these. They kind of correspond to what the historians use. Now, historians, I believe, prefer sedentary peoples. Why do historians like sedentary peoples? Yes.
It's much easier to track them archaeologically. I mean, if you're moving around from place to place, you might leave less of a trace in those places because you need to take everything with you.
Actually, I think that's true. Archaeologists also prefer sedentary peoples because they leave a lot more traces. But historians even more, but not necessarily because of what they leave. Why do historians love the sedentary peoples? And they don't so much like the non-sedentary peoples? Yes.
Buildings.
Well, historians, that's archaeology still. What do the historians need? Yes. Historical records, writing. Whenever there's writing, all of a sudden historians show up. And they like writing because that's what the whole history is based on, right? Otherwise, you're doing something else. You're doing archaeology. So if you have concentrated sedentary populations, then a bunch of historians are going to show up. They produce historians. Anthropologists, I don't know if all of us prefer them, but I think anthropologists tend to prefer hunting and gathering societies. Because, why? What don't hunting and gathering societies generally do? Write anything down. And so there's no historians to worry about. You don't have to worry about a bunch of historians coming around. You have them all to yourselves. You're talking about oral histories and talking to people, which is what anthropologists generally like to do. Every so often we go read things, but in general, in field work, we want to be talking to people, getting those histories that no one has ever got recorded. So there's your, but in some ways, these, again, these categories are kind of overlapping. Now,